The following program is from NET, the National Educational Television Network.
Debate: James Baldwin versus William Buckley. Subject: has the American dream been achieved at the expense of the American Negro? This debate was held recently at the Cambridge Union, Cambridge University, England.
Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper.
And I'm Alexei the Greek. And today we're privileged and honored and very happy to have Professor Nicholas Buccola. Hope I got that right, but, Ryan would have screwed it up worse. So
that's correct.
Very happy to have you here to talk about your new book, The Fire is Upon Us, about James Baldwin battling and demolishing William F. Buckley Jr. in Cambridge in 1965. Professor Buccola has written books before on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and very excited to talk about a great book and a great topic of importance in not just history, but politics, moral political philosophy. And there's a lot to glean about these two remarkable people and what they have to offer us today. So welcome, Nick. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys. I'm happy to be here.
So maybe we can start off. You can tell us how you got to this topic. And I see that in writing about Douglass and Lincoln, there's probably a natural, it seems like, evolution perhaps, but maybe set the stage for us about how this book came to be for you.
Yeah. So this book, Baldwin was my path to this book. So I was invited several years ago to write an essay about Baldwin for the political companion to James Baldwin that was being edited by Susan McWilliams. And when I started that project, I had, I was not nearly as familiar as Baldwin as I should have been. And I admitted that to Sue when she when she gave me the invitation, and she said, well, the essay won't be due for a couple of years, so you can devote a year to reading Baldwin and a year to writing. And so once I got started, I couldn't stop. Baldwin is such a fascinating figure, and I had never really read anyone quite like him. And there are a lot of challenges with Baldwin in terms of, like, I was trained, as a political theorist, and there's ways in which he's working on a kind of different level than I was used to. But I just couldn't stop. And at some point when I was sort of getting to know Baldwin, I found, the YouTube recording of the Buckley-Baldwin debate, and I was just transfixed. I mean, it was such a dramatic moment. These two guys with such radically different backgrounds, with worldviews that couldn't be, more different, just on this international stage at the apex of the civil rights movement. And so as I worked on the essay for Sue and that volume, I kept saying to myself, there's a book in here, there's a book in here. And so there was indeed a book. And then at first I thought about a smaller book, that would be sort of focused on Baldwin at Cambridge. There have been a couple books published about Malcolm X traveling to Oxford in 1964. But as I started doing the research, I realized, pretty quickly that there was this larger story to tell. They're born about a year apart from each other. And I sort of, it developed into this idea of a kind of joint intellectual biography set against the backdrop of the rise of the civil rights and conservative movements. So that's how the book came to be. And it was quite a process, but they were both really really fascinating subjects, and they're just so prolific, and so I had so much to work with. Once I had the format kind of figured out, it was the kind of book that, although there was plenty of work to be done, it was a kind of downhill book, and I kind of knew what I had to do.
Yeah. This maybe is a good route into one of the questions I had, or maybe it's more of an observation that might be interesting to listeners, which was that, in 1965, James Baldwin was a massive international celebrity, and the undergrads of Cambridge packed this debate hall mainly to see him because he was like the it guy. Yeah. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that and what, I think he's still pretty well remembered now, but I think that particular facet of his, his life story was somewhat forgotten.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ryan. I mean, this is something that, and certainly as I began working on the book, this was something that was an education to me, right? That just getting a sense of just how, how high Baldwin's star had ascended by that moment. So in 1965, Baldwin's been, around as a public intellectual for almost a decade and a half at that point, but his rise was this kind of steady rise from the late 40s, first as a literary critic, where he begins kind of making a name for himself, critiquing the work of others, to his first novel, Go Tell on the Mountain, and then his second, Giovanni's Room. And these are both novels that are very well received, and definitely people are sort of recognizing him as this really significant fiction writer, but also as a writer of nonfiction. His essays, very early on, he gets invited to write pieces for a lot of magazines on the left, and he's just sort of has this voice that I think was really unique. And so by the time 65 comes around, he's actually in England at the time to promote the paperback release of his third novel, Another Country. And of course, in 63, The Fire Next Time had been published based on the long New York essay that was published in late 62. So he is somebody who, he's been on the cover of Time magazine in, May 1963 as kind of a face of the Black liberation struggle. And he's somebody who's just, Malcolm X called him the poet of the civil rights revolution. And I think, what Malcolm meant by that is Baldwin was somebody who, as a writer, although Baldwin was always kind of, his role was always this kind of complicated thing. He calls himself a witness. He doesn't like the label activist, doesn't like the label spokesman, but he's clearly there as, Malcolm said, as a poet, as somebody who's writing it all down, who's trying, through his writing to capture, to the best he can, the sense of what's happening in the country, but also to go beyond just capturing it and actually playing a role in bringing about racial justice. So by the time they meet at Cambridge, the students, as you said, 700 of them pack into that Union debating hall, 500 more in the rooms elsewhere on the Union premises. The BBC is there. It's really this international event. And Buckley was definitely a very famous man in the U.S. at the time, but the international audience they knew through the press coverage leading up to the debate that basically what to expect. A right-wing guy who'd been a critic of civil rights who's sharing a platform with Baldwin. So they're drawn by Baldwin alone, but also they're drawn by the anticipation of the clash that's about to occur.
Yeah. And this, an interesting contrast here with Baldwin, who grew up, kind of working class poor in Harlem, was with some aspects of, actually the entire aspect, every bit about William F. Buckley's upbringing, which I knew sort of vaguely, but not in any detail, but that just he was insanely rich, just an absolute, scion of privilege from his first breath. And, sort of what jumped out at me of that difference, because it was reflected in both their background and in their, the debate, was that privilege. Buckley was just the walking manifestation, a guy, who was born to extreme wealth, had servants waiting on him hand and foot, huge estates, and this black fellow who had to just grind, just had to become so good to make it into the sort of upper echelons of society, and also, draw a whole bunch of lucky breaks at the same time, like anybody must. But, when they're meeting, you just see what a completely tilted playing field that the entire society is based on, is, like in this, why I'm quite sure that Baldwin won, because he had to work. He was a much smarter and more interesting and more honest person than William F. Buckley, who was just, like had some sort of wit and, charm about him. But at the end of the day, he was not a deep thinker. Right. And I, it seemed like a real interesting, sort of just like embodiment of the argument itself, their representative biographies, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's really well put, Ryan. I think that's one of the reasons the story is so compelling, right? I mean, as you say, I mean, Buckley is somebody, he's born in New York City, and I say in the beginning of the book, Baldwin's born in New York City, Buckley's born in New York City, but they may as well have been born on different planets, in the sense that, as you said, I mean, Buckley is born to immense wealth. His family owns this 47-acre estate that he spends most of his childhood, and he describes growing up there as this, it's this completely idyllic set of circumstances. They've got as you mentioned, the servants waiting on them. They've got live-in tutors so that the Buckley children are homeschooled. It's very elaborate homeschooling they get. And essentially, Buckley has, as you said, he's really the embodiment of privilege in so many ways. And his parents, though, I mean, one of the things that's really fascinating about the Buckley upbringing is that, they provide their children with, anything a kid could ever want. But one of the things that's very clear is that they're determined to teach their children that they have a responsibility to defend a particular worldview, right? And so that worldview, especially coming from William F. Buckley Sr., who was, awash in kind of new money. He was somebody who'd made and lost and regained fortunes. And so he thinks of himself, right, the sort of mythology that he believes about himself is that he is a self-made man, and that he wants to teach his children that they, as elites, have a responsibility to defend a particular worldview that made their affluence possible. And so Buckley never really wants to become his father. He doesn't seem tempted by that life of the life and business, but he does definitely see his goal in life is to defend his father's worldview. And that's precisely what, from a very young age, he's determined, and I don't want to get too, psychoanalytic here, but he's determined to please his father, by way of rhetoric, by way of language. And it's one of the kind of interesting parallels in the story is that while Buckley is doing that, right, from a very young age, kind of thinking about ways to use words to defend his father's individualism, his father's, elitism, Baldwin is somebody who also, grabs onto language at a very young age, but is of course, as you mentioned, language. He's using language in a very different way, right? He's growing up in Harlem at the margins of the margins. And experiencing a life that is, marked by domination in all sorts of different ways that he describes so powerfully in both his autobiographical writings, but also his fictional writings, especially in Go Tell on the Mount, when he describes what it was like, in sort of in the semi-autobiographical way through several characters to kind of give you a sense of what that life was like, and also what life was like for people like his parents who had come to the North, as part of, the Great Migration, looking for the American dream, right? And so Baldwin, I think, is somebody who then, in this very different way, is looking to books, looking to language to try to make sense of his own experience, and also to kind of articulate what life looks like through the eyes of someone like him, a teenager growing up in Harlem. So yeah, that's I think a really powerful parallel in the story.
I think there's so much in here right now because all of this alights how Baldwin brings up the role of identity and power, and you bring up through this book how their different positions of power and relative privilege or marginalized background informs these obstacles or opportunities as you just described. And there's also the psychological response to various parents And for example, the Buckley's mother and the kind of hierarchy that she is operating that gives him the sense that natural hierarchies can be just and somewhat serves his ideological understanding of how kind of white supremacist patriarchy could be the kind of civilization that is required to advance us. And, there are a lot of great connections you draw there, but, I want to follow up on, I think, what makes in part Baldwin, besides his genius, so much more interesting than Buckley is that the relative positions of power make Buckley basically, as you wrote, agree with all his family members about politics. The question of power is basically settled. The political goals are just uniformly agreed to, and all that you have to do is debate each other at the table and win rhetorically, a kind of sophistry to figure out the best ideological or mythological way to justify your domination scheme, right? Your political power structures. And so his whole, act basically is in pursuit of the kind of theater that we now see Trump successfully doing in a different kind of way, right? Which is just about like, how can I use a certain kind of myth making in the theater to cover up and support these structures of oppression instead of seeking wisdom, right? In a real philosophical sense, being a lover of truth and wisdom, and therefore having the sight that an artist, a poet like Baldwin has and is forced to have in order to reckon with the realities of oppression that he can't escape. And I think that has some, psychological, biographical, sociological roots that are very interesting to see in how you have a much more interesting, brilliant, artist and speaker, and philosopher, going up against this just kind of facade of a philosopher, facade of a person who doesn't have to, has the privilege not to look at actual injustice and what it would require to overcome it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a sense in which, that really is that. I mean, you said it beautifully. I don't know how I can say it much more beautifully than that. But I mean, to amplify what you just said, Alexi. I mean, the idea. I mean, there's the Buckley and his siblings. I mean, they're definitely. You're right. I mean, there's not really a moment where they reflect in a sort of serious way about the commitments that they've been talking. There's a couple examples of them moving away from their parents' views that maybe we'll get to later. But but yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which, I mean, there's this moment when Buckley's at Yale and his debate coach suggests to him that he ought to take a course in metaphysics, and Buckley's response is, "I have God and my father. That's all I need." Right. So part of what they're doing, right, is and Buckley especially becomes a master at performing this kind of elitism, performing this conservatism, and he's masterful at it, right? This is one thing that's so alluring about Buckley. One of the things I found fascinating as I worked on the book is that a lot of people I talked to, especially of kind of older generations, even if they loathed Buckley's politics, they had this kind of soft spot for him, because he kind of performed this kind of intellectualism that if you poke at it for any extended amount of time, you realize that it is very, very shallow. But he was very good at it, and he does this at Cambridge really well. I mean, one of the cool things about what we were able to uncover with the research for the book is the BBC recording is actually not complete. The Buckley speech is cut by about a third to fit within an hour time period that the BBC had to show the debate. Oh. And one of the things that's cut out is a lot of Buckley's responses to student questions. And so Buckley got all these, tough questions from the students during the course of his speech. And, 201, he's very good at these are tough questions, and he is able to deflate the situation with his wit and his charm and make everybody laugh. And then you almost forget what this really tough question was. And so that's significant, right? I mean, as you're pointing out, that his stylistic way of performing conservatism, in many ways let him off the hook. And in many ways is one of the reasons why he's gotten, I think, this kind of very charitable reading after his death, is like people always saying, I wish we had more William F. Buckleys. But yeah, and then on the other side of that, just quickly, I mean, with Baldwin, is both of you have pointed out, Baldwin says, he really describes so powerfully the experience of invisibility, right? I mean, so part of what he describes is the sense in which, as someone at the margins, people like Buckley have never even noticed he's really there. I mean, Baldwin says, to someone like Buckley, essentially, I'm I'm like a piece of furniture, right? I mean, there's not really a sense in which he's really had to think about what my experience is like. And so Baldwin, and part of what Baldwin thinks is so threatening about Black liberation, and part of the reason he thinks somebody like Buckley is on some level really scared, is that he is scared of being described, right? Baldwin says, we on the other hand, we could not treat you as invisible. We've had to watch you very, very closely in order to survive. And now we're here and we're ready to tell our story. And that's what scares you more than anything else, is we are here to, tell the story and to expose you for what you really are. So those are some of those powerful moments and as a researcher and as a writer for me, were those moments when Baldwin, when he's confronting Buckley's go-to guy on race, James Kilpatrick, in 62, and he's got this segregationist in front of him, and he's there to interrogate him and to reveal him for what he really is.
Yeah. Yeah. This book reminded me of a classic review essay by George Xalapa. I think how you pronounce that? Probably not. Probably butchering it. But it's a review of John Judas's biography of Buckley, and one of the points he makes in there is that Buckley sort of fancied himself this great intellectual, and for most of his life planned like a big book that he never wrote, which would be like a very weighty, very heavy philosophical defense of his politics. And it's pretty obvious he never wrote it because he was incapable of resolving the huge contradiction at the heart of his type of politics, which is, ostensibly a defense of, the existing social norms, status quo hierarchies, all the inherited wisdom of the past. And then on the other hand, unregulated capitalism, which can just rend the social fabric in every conceivable way. And, those smarter conservatives like Whittaker Chambers, were totally alive to how major a threat capitalism, unregulated capitalism, was to, the social order. And yet he was just this sort of, smiling dope. But perhaps to change gears slightly on the topic of Buckley, one thing that you get into, which maybe has been sort of forgotten to later generations, is just how fucking racist Buckley was, and how much his politics, which supposedly were this era of genteel, learned conservatives, was really quite prefigurative of the Trump, frankly, and the politics of Trumpism and the politics of restricting the ballot box. In fact, that was an interesting thing I learned from the book, because I hadn't heard that, because I think I must have watched on YouTube the truncated BBC version. But in one of those questions, if I'm not mistaken, Buckley says, we should let black people vote in theory, but we should also prevent 65% of white people from voting, because, we need only the good people, which is people who vote Republican, conservative, to be voting, right?
Yeah. I mean, so just to take those two together, I mean, one thing that's interesting about the Buckley book that was never written, right? The big book, as he kept calling it, which he told James Burnham, one of his associates at National Review, I want to write something like Leo Strauss's Natural Right and History. And so Buckley had a title for it, and it was going to be called The Revolt Against the Masses. And it was essentially, in the kind of the kind of notes he had for it, and the meetings he had about it with some of his trusted colleagues, were essentially what he wanted to write about was a kind of restoration of hierarchy that he thought was going to sort of play out over the course of the 60s. And a central part of that restoration of hierarchy was this kind of anti-blackness. I mean, he essentially sees that the revolt, the white backlash against the Black liberation struggle, Buckley sees, and he says this in his notes for the book, that the white backlash might be the sort of key to a restoration of hierarchy. And so he ends up saying that, rather than, this kind of explanation that he couldn't write the book because he wasn't a deep thinker, he says, I couldn't write the book because my my kind of thesis was proven wrong, that there wasn't a restoration of hierarchy that I thought would happen. So it's a little bit of both, right?
But also I want to say, whatever you think of Leo Strauss, I've read Leo Strauss. William F. Buckley Jr., you, sir, are no Leo Strauss.
Yeah, I think I can agree to that for sure. But going back to, Ryan's question about the sort of Buckley's racial politics. I mean, this is something where, I had a sense of Buckley's racial politics from some of the great work that's been done by others. Joe Lowndes at University of Oregon has done some wonderful work, and a lot of others just sort of looking at Buckley and his crew and kind of the role that they play in American political development and and on the question of racial politics. But what I try to do in the book is really, look at that in some really real depth and in some slow motion, and kind of really get behind the scenes a little bit and look at the interoffice memos at National Review and look at some of the letters Buckley's writing and so I in some sense go far deeper than probably anyone wants to go with kind of William F. Buckley's thinking on race. And I think that what is revealed there is not only, you have Buckley basically saying that his goal when he founds National Review, and it starts in November 1955, and of course the sort of ramp up to the launch in November 55 is really begins earlier. So you think about what's happening in that period in terms of American racial politics with Brown v. Board, the backlash against Brown v. Board, the Southern Manifesto, the White Citizens Councils rising, the lynching of Emmett Till, the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott. All that is happening right in that same 2-year period when Buckley's launching National Review. And it was not a foregone conclusion that, a conservative magazine being started at that time would be overwhelmingly hostile to everything, having to do with Black liberation. There were, of course, the partisan politics were complicated on racial questions. And there were also people who thought of themselves as conservative Republicans who were, at least not hostile to civil rights. People like William Noland is an example that I bring up in the book. But Buckley makes it very clear, and he says this 10 years later on the 10th anniversary of National Review, that his goal was for National Review to be, on questions of race, extremely articulate, non-racist, but not reflexively racially egalitarian, right? So he has this idea that there, and this is very clear, right? I mean, he succeeds in that goal, right? In a sense, right? What he thinks of is non-racist, right? And of course he's wrong. But he thinks that you're not racist if you're not expressing racial animus, right? For Buckley, that's crucial. And this is where, Alexi's point earlier about his mother is really important, because Buckley, nothing rankled him more than people like his mother, who were clearly racist. Like, she believed in, the sort of biological superiority of white people, but she also believed in this kind of noblesse oblige, this obligation that, white elites had to take care of people of color, especially those who were loyal, right? Buckley was so upset when somebody like her mother was put in the same category as somebody like George Wallace or a Klansman. And so Buckley really believed that his kind of paternalistic kind of racism that wasn't rooted in animus was defensible morally and politically. And so, but with the sort of end result of this is that he goes through this period that I'm looking at in the book, and they are, from the word go, they are anti-Brown, they are sympathetic, and even in some ways are working behind the scenes with the White Citizens Council. They are writing fawning pieces about people like Strom Thurmond in National Review. They're against the Civil Rights Act. They're against the Voting Rights Act. They're critics of the sit-in protesters. They're critics of the Freedom Riders. And so the position, right, Buckley is doing this thing with his politics where he's trying to carve out this space for a kind of sophisticated, quasi-intellectual, racist politics. And that, in some ways, and this is where Baldwin, I think, is so powerful as a lens, right? Because Baldwin, sees exactly what people like Buckley are up to, right? And what he's here to say is that, in many ways, what Buckley's up to is far more sinister. And I think the great example, the most powerful example of this in the book is that debate I mentioned earlier with Kilpatrick, who James Jackson Kilpatrick, for folks who haven't thought about him recently, was known as like the leading salesman for segregation in the country. A newspaper editor, writer who's essentially devoted his professional life to being the sort of squire of massive resistance. And he is Buckley's go-to guy on race. He's Buckley's link to the White Citizens Council. Buckley is commissioning to write pieces about things like the Little Rock crisis. And Baldwin has an opportunity to debate Kilpatrick on the Open Mind television show in late 1962, and it's just after the battle at Ole Miss, right? So James Meredith, Black Air Force veteran, is trying to register for classes at the University of Mississippi, and all hell breaks loose. You essentially have an armed insurrection that has to be quelled by federal troops. And Baldwin sits down with Kilpatrick, Buckley's go-to guy on race, just a couple weeks later on the Open Mind. And the first thing Baldwin does is he says, you think there's a difference between men like you who write these sophisticated books, but Kilpatrick had just published a book-length defense of segregation, who write sophisticated books and you wear nice suits and you write in all these highfalutin journals. Do you think there's a difference between people like you and those people in the streets who are committing acts of violence in the name of white supremacy? And Baldwin says, I hold you, sir, far more responsible than the people in those streets. They are in many ways enthralled to a delusion they don't really understand, this delusion of white supremacy, and you are weaving that web of delusion and you're keeping those people enthralled. So Baldwin says, I accuse you of betraying them, not of betraying me. I accuse you of betraying them. So Baldwin was really here to tell us that people like Kilpatrick, people like Buckley, in some ways they are far more responsible because they are weaving these webs for purposes that have nothing to do with the poor white people in the South, right? And Buckley makes this very clear again and again in the period I cover in the book.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, this actually in retrospect is kind of eerie when when Buckley ran for mayor of New York City, right? He got 13% of the vote. But the 13% he got was not from the well-heeled, Upper West Side bankers. It was from like the sort of white ethnic lumpen proletariat who were, they could hear the dog whistles, and they liked a smart sounding guy who could stick it to the libs, triggering the libs. I mean, that's another Buckley innovation, right? He just loved to provoke people and to be maximally aggressive.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's a really important point. And this is something as I started the research for the book in earnest in 2015, and then I really sat down to start writing in January 2016. And there was a sense in which, and maybe this comes through to readers, that as I'm, of course, all these issues being addressed in the book have been and will, they have been relevant for a long time. But in the sense of the urgency of the issues and the ways in which they were, so obvious in our headlines in ways that maybe they'd been more subtle before. It kind of ramped up as I worked on the book and finally, handed in the manuscript in the spring. This is where Buckley, in this, again, looking at him in slow motion, I think is really a powerful thing to do, because you see in like late 64, that there's clearly this shift happening in American politics, and you have Goldwater, who's voted against the Civil Rights Act, and you have, race is clearly become a central, issue in presidential politics in a way that it had not been in the 60 election in quite the same way. And so what's fascinating about that, and it really anticipates where we are today, is that Buckley, late 64, he commissions a special section of National Review on race in the campaign. And in this time when you have the Goldwater is, the solidly Democratic South, the Deep South is now Goldwater country, right? And you have all this criticism of Goldwater for voting against the Civil Rights Act. You have all, questions of voting rights are central in the national discussion. Buckley doesn't devote any of this special section of National Review to any of those issues, right? He just ignores them. He knows, first of all, he knows Goldwater is going to lose, but he knows that the Deep South is one, right? So why he's not going to sort of even consider those issues. Instead, what he does is he devotes the special section first to a framing essay about white backlash, and essentially, the writer offers these kind of philosophical reasons why white people are feeling marginalized by Black liberation, and they should be. The article argues. And then two pieces that follow that are, one is about busing in New York, and the other is about fair housing law in California, right? Which that same electorate that overwhelmingly supported Johnson in California. Many of those same people who were, casting their ballot for Johnson also voted to overturn the fair housing law that had been adopted in 63. So Buckley sees this kind of politics of racial resentment. He also, in that period, although he's not a huge fan of George Wallace, right? He writes something critical of George Wallace in 63. In 64, he writes pieces praising George Wallace for challenging Lyndon Johnson in those 3 primaries and doing quite well. And essentially, Buckley makes the argument, Wallace isn't really a racist. He's not talking about race. He's getting all the support in these primaries because he's channeling, and Buckley calls one of these pieces the white backlash, and he praises it. He says white people are feeling marginalized. They're feeling like they're being left out of the conversation, and they should be righteously indignant about that. And so Buckley is this is one of the great ironies, right? Is one of the great elitists in the history of American politics, ends up being a populist candidate for mayor of New York. And of course, here we are today with the apprentice in chief, right? I mean, we're reliving this, and of course, Trump's style is very different from Buckley's style. But as you said, Buckley was the thing that Buckley did better than anything else, right? Was he was so good at triggering his opponents. He was never good at defending his own views, but he was very good at sticking his thumb in people's eye and sort of attacking the other side in ways that could get people fired up. Again, his style is very different from Trump. But this is something like we've seen this show before.
But in many ways, they're very similar insofar as we've kind of pointed out, the theater, right? The theater serves to disarm and win debate rhetorically without having to make substantive arguments because there's no actual truth that's being defended, in the same way that Trump just demolished people in debates by calling them Lion Ted or using all these tricks, of rhetoric in his own vulgar way, right? So it's like a different aesthetic, but the moves are very similar and populist in similar ways insofar as you're like bypassing reason, to create a certain image of somebody that should be supported because you like who they are and you like their style and you like who they're defeating. That's all very helpful to understanding the appeal and the appeal to people who perhaps need to, find in this cult leader the power that they don't have in their normal lives, and to appeal to the power of like white supremacy in order to not lose the wages of whiteness, right? And that's all very, very interesting and important to understand descriptively so that we could kind of diagnose and defeat the enemy that is kind of white supremacy and, fascist politics that's globally in ascendance. But, as they did with the debate, I think we should give more time to the true genius and poet, Baldwin. And insofar as in actual substance, the difference between Trump and Buckley is not really consequential, I don't think. And all the differences that appear to be significant, even though retrospectively, I wish we could go back to the days of Buckley, is in fact bullshit, right? And insofar as the asymmetry there, where we look back and everybody loved the civil rights movement, everybody loved Martin Luther King Jr., right? That is total bullshit too, right? They were villainized and demonized. Similarly, the actual difference between, say, a Baldwin, and you bring this out beautifully, a Baldwin, a Malcolm X, and a Martin Luther King Jr., the vast differences in their moral arguments, philosophical arguments, and approach to spirituality, its relationship to politics, to political possibility, the nuance and differences there reveal that these were people of real genius who had real contributions to make and did make, because they were connected to something challenging and beautiful in their struggle. So maybe we could talk a bit about Baldwin and how he related to those contemporaries that he, that you compare him to and kind of illuminate the relationships among.
Yeah. Thank you for pulling us back to Baldwin. It's hard not to, sort of the Buckley side of the story, and a lot of these conversations is really. It's alluring to talk about, but we should talk about the true genius, as you're saying.
It's
Baldwin,
kind of like the train wreck that you can't look away from, right? It's like,
and so Baldwin, Baldwin is somebody. I mean, and I appreciate the bringing King and Malcolm to the conversation. I mean, one of the things that was really fascinating about this period is that and Baldwin is such a in terms of the way he's approaching these questions, because he has this kind of tension in himself between what he sees as his obligation as a witness, his obligations as an artist, and his obligations to engage, right? His obligations to try to play a part in moving the country closer to racial justice. I think he's really a fascinating character because he's somebody who he's elusive, right? I mean, he's not somebody who's ever comfortable being categorized, being labeled, whether it's ideologically, his sexuality. He wants to definitely challenge us to rethink, the ways we understand race. So, I mean, Baldwin is somebody who is, as I look at the kind of arc from the late 40s to the late 60s when the book kind of wraps up, he is remarkably consistent in the sense that, he really wants us to focus on this nexus between, identity, morality, and power, right? Who is it that we take ourselves to be? And how does that lead us to treat other human beings? And so who has power and who doesn't? And how does that, and why, right? And what can we do about it? I mean, those are the kind of the three big questions that I see Baldwin grappling with from his earliest writings through the end. And I think Baldwin is somebody who, because that is his focus. I mean, he often gets in some trouble, right, with a lot of people around him in the sense that they want him to be more definitive about a particular political question or a particular moral question, but he's always there to be. One of my friends, Joel Schlosser, has this great essay on Baldwin called "Socrates in a Different Key." Right, he's kind of a Socratic sort of character in that he means to be unsettling, right? He has this idea of his role is, always, drive to the heart of every answer to expose the question that it hides. I mean, that's really that's a Baldwin mantra. And so, but what that means is as he engages with people, like first as a journalist and as somebody who's playing this role of witness, as he engages with somebody like King, engages with Malcolm, he is of course an ally, but he's also somebody who wants to think through, like he wants to try to understand, like, what does the world look like through the eyes of Martin Luther King, who's so young and is placed in this position of immense responsibility in the struggle. And what is Malcolm, what is it that Malcolm, how can we understand, Malcolm's, evolution? Why is he attracted to the ideas of Elijah Muhammad, who of course Baldwin's a little bit suspicious of. And so I think Baldwin is somebody who, as we think through, what is this liberation struggle really, and what is it about, and what is it that's impeding not only the freedom and fulfillment of people at the margins, but Baldwin is always there to say, this is a liberation struggle for everyone, right? This is a liberation struggle that has to do with not only liberating those who are the so-called subjugated, as he calls them in the Cambridge speech, but also the subjugators, the would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy are also its victims, which is something that Baldwin, wanted to say in his own way, that it was also a theme in King's writing. So, yeah, so I mean, Baldwin, there's so many, aspects of this we could go into, and I want to sort of allow you to push me in a particular direction. But yeah, Baldwin, I think, is really powerful in that he does always push us to. He doesn't let anybody off the hook, right? He's there to. He's extraordinarily morally demanding. He always, in all these moments of sort of triumph in the Black liberation struggle, whether it's a court case or a piece of legislation or an election, Baldwin is always there to say, okay, yes, but, like, this is good, but I want to know what the world looks like through the eyes of, a teenager at the margins of one of this country's ghettos, and I want us to think through how has the world changed dramatically for that person, and what is our responsibility? What is each of our responsibilities in order to change the world and make it a more humane place? So those are a couple scattered thoughts, but yeah, push me in a particular direction.
Yeah. Actually, you brought up one thing I wanted definitely to dig into, which was the idea that racism is bad for white people. And that,
not just bad, worse.
Yeah, right. I was just getting to that. Which is interesting to me because, it's rhetorically kind of like an interesting sort of jujitsu move. It contrasts with, I would say, a lot of contemporary discourse, or kind of like what I would say like Afro-pessimism movement. That I hear from people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who say that, kind of tend to argue that racism is like a kind of it's an objective choice that people have made and it benefits them, concretely in certain ways. And that's a thing. That's a thing I resist because I'm just like instinctively biased against it because it seems to imply that if I knew it was good for me, I should become racist. And that's something that I just like categorically reject out of hand. But the way Baldwin does it, to say that not only is racism bad for white people, it's actually worse than what happens to white people in the South, to committed racists in the South, is in some ways much worse than what happens to black people there. And so could you dig into that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is something where I think there are ways in which some of the themes of Baldwin's philosophy might be out of step with particular intellectual trends and in our current moment, and that's I think that can be a fruitful thing, right, for us to think about. Okay, here's what Baldwin thought, and he may be wrong, but here's ways in which he might kind of be in tension with certain trends that we see around us. But yeah, I think on this question, Baldwin is it's a powerful theme throughout his writing, and it's certainly one of the key ideas in the Cambridge speech. And Baldwin is really there, as he says at the very beginning, like, I feel I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah. I'm here to say things you do not want to hear, and I'm here to deliver a sermon about white supremacy. And part of that sermon is to draw our attention to the ways in which white supremacy victimizes both what he calls the subjugated and the subjugators. And so on the sort of the subjugated side, I think what Baldwin does really, really, in a way that's, I think, in some ways subtle the first time you hear the speech, but comes through more powerfully, at least for me, the more I sort of thought about the speech, is that remember, the motion before the House is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And so Baldwin talks about the American dream in, I think, a lot of powerful ways. And one of the most powerful is to say, he says, when he's talking about the impact of white supremacy on its most obvious victims, right, the what he calls the subjugated, is that the ways in which, first he says, he talks about the ways in which white supremacy destroys one's sense of reality, right? And that's a very, kind of powerful notion. What does he mean by that? I mean, part of what he's saying is that there's a sense in which white supremacy has this effect of kind of communicating to a human being, and Baldwin puts this so beautifully and powerfully through millions of details of every day that indicate to you that your life does not matter, right? That you are a worthless human being. And so as we think about in this moment, this Black Lives Matter, moment where we're thinking through like precisely what that means, I think Baldwin captures it so well. And he says, in terms of the connection to the American dream, and a way that's extraordinarily powerful, is he says that the ways in which you as an individual are being told in a million ways that your life doesn't matter as much as the lives of others, he says that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that you look at the next generation, right? You look at your son and your daughter or your niece or your nephew, and you have no reason to believe that things are going to be much better for them. And Baldwin, and that's a theme that goes back to one of his early essays, Notes of a Native Son, he describes in 1943 being in a church in Harlem at his father's funeral, and he looks around the room at the parents in that he looks around the church, and he sees these parents, and he says they're confronted by what he calls an impossibility, right? How do I equip my children for this world? How do I provide them with the power that they need to fight back against this world? And he says that's something that's just terrifying for a parent at the margins of society. And so I think that, and you think about the American dream, right? This idea that maybe perhaps you will not be able to achieve financial success or success in however you define it, but you can have this hope that the next generation might. Baldwin's saying no. I mean, there's really a sense in which, and this is where he is, drawing our attention to the reasons why one might be pessimistic, right? Which is really important. Although he does not want us to become pessimistic, he thinks that's important. We keep that in mind. But as you're pointing out, on the other side of that, he says, he gives the example of Jim Clark, right? On the sort of the subjugator side, right? The people who are also victims of white supremacy. And Jim Clark, in that moment, right, the same night of the debate, we're in the midst of the Selma campaign, right? So in Marion, Alabama, there are African Americans, civil rights activists who are being victimized that very night by Jim Clark and others And Jim Clark is, being, on newspapers and on television with his cattle prod, using it against, men, women, and children in the streets of Alabama. And Baldwin says, Jim Clark, he says he may appear, he is not a monster. He is a human being. He loves his wife. He loves his children. He likes to get drunk, I mean, he's a human. And so it's this really powerful moment. The students, of course, can kind of, connect to this, especially the idea of getting drunk. And so he says, but think about when Jim Clark uses that cattle prod, what's happening to his victims is ghastly. But as you pointed out, what's happening to him inside of himself is in some ways much, much worse. And Baldwin is, what I think he's trying to get at there is that in terms of those questions of identity, morality, and power, Jim Clark's sense of identity, his sense of his role in the world, the role he ought to play in the world, the way he ought to use his power, all of that is bound up in this delusion of white supremacy. His sense of worth, right? Everything for him is that, his job is to be a guardian of that fortress of white supremacy. And Baldwin is saying, what does that mean about, in terms of his moral life, right? This human being is enthralled to this idea, and that he can never achieve freedom. He can never achieve fulfillment. So when Baldwin said, we have obligations, right? When he writes that letter to his nephew in late 62 and is published as the kind of introduction to Fire Next Time in 63, he says to his nephew, your responsibility, right? Part of your responsibility is to love your oppressor, right? And that's not something that, and again, Baldwin might be wrong about this, but for Baldwin, love is not a sentimental thing. It's not a cute and cuddly thing. Love for Baldwin is confrontation. Love is a battle. Love is a war. And so part of what our obligation is to confront one another and try to liberate one another from the delusions under which we live. So, and that, that's messy. And I don't know, exactly what that means politically. I think is a long and difficult conversation that we are, I think, engaged in hopefully every day. And that's what Baldwin would tell us we have to do, is we should argue with each other and try to figure out what it means to try to liberate one another, because that's a very complicated thing.
Yeah, the just a side note here. I was just recently listening to a Martin Luther King sermon in which he talked about the three different Greek words for love, and there was eros and one I can't remember.
Philia. We're in Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, so erotic love, brotherly love, and then
agape.
That's right.
Right? Yeah. And he's so when Martin Luther King's reasoning, love your enemy, love the white supremacist Jim Clark, that's the agape kind of love, which is that you love, in his view, you love that person because all people are made in the image of God. And so, you are required not to like them. You may hate them. In fact, in the sort of brotherly love sense, you may, some people are very hard to like, but, it's an interesting, powerful kind, you see how that kind of reasoning could be so, kind of influential in allowing people to do these sort of nonviolent protests and so on,
and perhaps transformative. And so you mentioned the importance of debate, but I wonder if part of the reason that Baldwin didn't want to be pinned down in any way. He said, I'm going to be called a materialist, a Marxist, a socialist, gay, straight. There is something about his message, it seems to me, of love and human dignity, and the need to understand that if you see the fullness of humanity in everyone, that will transform you, transfigure you in a way that will bestow dignity upon all people, and that will prevent you from attaching yourself to this, white supremacist or American exceptionalist or any other ideological or even, poser religious garb that helps you justify and rationalize the oppression and the domination of other human beings. There's something so interesting to me about how what's really needed is epiphany, and it's not for nothing that a person that doesn't really claim to be religious is nonetheless very spiritual and presents himself in this debate right from the outset as Jeremiah and giving a Jeremiah, right? Like what people need. And so in this, you think we're a debate here. We need somebody to win rhetorically. We need argument. We need reasons. And he's like, no, we need a prophet, right? We need somebody to get people to transform themselves entirely because they will conclude, he says it's a loaded question because they will conclude whatever logically follows from their position and their system of reality that they've kind of taken. And so unless you pull the whole transformation over someone, or unless you pull somebody through that, they're just going to reason from within that worldview and stay in their position of power.
Yeah, those are both really, really, I think, important points. I mean, the sort of, you know, comparison to King's philosophy of love, and also, this idea of, Baldwin. And this comes through really powerfully for folks who haven't checked out. You can listen to some of Baldwin's. He has 2 debates with Malcolm X in 1961, and there's one that's really, really powerful where it's Baldwin is on a radio show with one of the student sit-in protesters is there as well, and it's like I think it's one of those powerful exchanges, that at least public exchanges with Malcolm, where that's like early Malcolm, right, where he's like, he's there in part to, kind of like they're invited onto the show together because, the host knows that they will be in some tension, right? That Malcolm is going to be there to criticize the nonviolent method, to criticize the nonviolent philosophy, and that Baldwin is going to be there to at least provide Malcolm with some pushback. And one of the things that's fascinating about that exchange is, I think, relevant to what both of you just said, is that Malcolm does his thing, right, in a very powerful way, and Baldwin does a couple things I think are really, just sort of classic Baldwin. One is that, he very early on, right, although Baldwin is not a conventional political theorist, he's doing political theory right there before our eyes, because he listens to the sit-in protester, this guy Laverne McCummings, and Malcolm go back and forth a little bit about what their understanding of what sort of Black liberation is about. And Baldwin says, I hear a lot of words flying around this table: freedom, democracy, justice, it's not entirely clear that we know what they mean. And so I want to push both of you also this word integration, like what do we mean by integration and why is that a good thing? The word equality, right? Baldwin was always kind of, he raises some questions about whether or not equality should be thought of as a sort of central moral goal. And, he's worried about it in particular ways. He, of course, believes in it in certain fundamental ways, but he's also worried about it as a sufficient moral goal. And then by the end of the conversation, and he and Malcolm have had some pretty tense exchange. Baldwin says, I want to say something very reckless, which is that essentially all theories are suspect, all theologies are suspect, all ideologies are suspect. What I want for human beings is and he says, for me, I want to be able to confront the world as me, to try to deal with the world in each day and each moment in as dynamic a way as possible. And so, that again is a reason that a lot of people, Baldwin gets, I think, some pushback later in his life for that kind of resisting particular ideologies and so on, because, people get frustrated with this elusiveness. They want to know, okay, are you with us or are you not with us? We need a program here, and you're kind of raising all these questions. But that's part of what Baldwin's, that's Baldwin's genius. It might be one of the reasons to critique Baldwin, but he really was there to raise these questions and just to try to challenge us to think through, these questions in a way that was deeply philosophical and deeply rooted in this idea of human dignity, and always kind of there to, to sort of, cause us to be suspicious of particular ideologies and so on. And so, I mean, there's a really important moment that captures this, and I'll stop talking. Is like, he talks about, one of his essays on Richard Wright. He talks about the influence of, people like Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre on Richard Wright. And Baldwin says very explicitly, he says, I never liked, that crew. I never trusted them. And his one-line explanation of it is that I worried that ideas mattered to them more than people, right? So, I mean, Baldwin is this like deep humanism, and whether or not that's true of Sartre and de Beauvoir is for another show. But it's a powerful, for Baldwin, right, as he perceived it, that was always the danger, is if ideas become more important to us than human beings, then that was where, he thought human dignity was threatened. And that's complicated, that's frustrating, but I think it's something we need to grapple with if we're going to grapple with Baldwin.
This is getting good. Just a quick follow-up to that, if you don't mind. It seems to me quite obvious that Baldwin unmasked Buckley in that debate for a number of reasons, outclassed him. But I think do you think there are lessons that can be drawn if we see Buckley as representative of those privileged elites who are trying to shape kind of the superstructures, the hegemonic ideologies that justify, rationalize, and serve the status quo oppressive forces of the state and capitalism today, how that was so easily dispensed with, not just by a person of genius, but by someone drawing on that kind of moral, spiritual, philosophical complexity and drawing on all of that we just talked about in terms of what Baldwin had to offer. So is there something for us politically today and individually and collectively that we can learn about how to combat those elites, those people, those ideologies that we're fighting against?
Yeah, absolutely. And I worry a little bit when I do the kind of shtick I just did about Baldwin as this kind of skeptic and so on, that I don't want it to come across like he's this Michael Oakeshott or something.
He's not a trimmer, right? Like that's not, yeah.
or David Brooks or something. Because right, and this is the big but, is that Baldwin at the same time, right, is a radical, right? He's a radical thinker. His moralism is about as radical as you can get, and in some sense he is a kind of radically democratic thinker. So to tie those two things together, Baldwin is somebody who, as I mentioned before, is always pushing us to think about these political questions from the margins of the margins, right? And as you pointed out earlier, in some ways, like his story, right, his autobiography, the person that he is, helps us understand why from a very young age he was very sensitive to thinking about things from the margins of the margins of the margins, and so where does that take us politically? I mean, part of what Baldwin, I think that one of the things he does, I think, really powerfully is he pushes back against a certain kind of politics that we might call liberal politics of concern, right? So he, in the Cambridge speech and in his writings and elsewhere, and we know just from experiences in his life, there's a kind of liberalism that I think he associates with the Kennedys and to some extent with Lyndon Johnson, that he kind of feels like, some of their intentions might be good, but he often feels like they treat people of color as statistics or a problem to be solved, as opposed to as human beings. And there's obviously ways in which Baldwin's also uncomfortable with the kind of politics that I was describing before, that is, from Baldwin's perspective, kind of so ideological that it seems to be abstracted from reality. But so where does that leave us politically? I mean, where it leaves us is, if we take this idea of human dignity seriously, then part of what I think Baldwin thinks it means is that we, as we are attempting to free ourselves from delusion each and every day, each and every moment, we are, he hopes, getting a sense of our own power as individuals and our own power collectively, right? So when Baldwin's out there in 1963 delivering what essentially is his stump speech, right? So he's at the height of his fame. He's, Fire Next Time is on the bestseller list, for 41 weeks, and essentially 63, much to the chagrin of his, his agents and so on. And, he's out there speaking. I mean, he's really in the kind of mode of, even though he doesn't want to be a spokesman, he's out there on the road. And when he's out there on the road giving these speeches, he's, this is a moment, right, when, Kennedy is in office, and there's a kind of a feeling that the sort of history is shifting in a progressive direction. Baldwin is out there still with this kind of skepticism about politicians, a kind of skepticism about being too bound up in whatever piece of legislation is the latest, thing that we're talking about. All those things are important, right? He doesn't want to say we should ignore legislation or court decisions or elected officials, but he's really, the theme of those speeches politically is he wants to say to people, look, you have the power to change, the society in a very direct way. So the example he gives in 63 is he's trying to convince people, he says, I don't want you to go I don't want you to go Christmas shopping. I don't want you to go Christmas shopping this year. I want you to communicate with your behavior your dissatisfaction with the state of this country. And he's talking about the March on Washington, he wants that to be as radical a demonstration as possible. I mean, there's examples of things that he would like to see happen, direct, forms of direct action that, he's very, in some ways he's celebrates the March on Washington. There again, he wanted the March on Washington to be far radical than it was. So yeah, I mean, Baldwin is this kind of radically democratic thinker in that way. He really wants to call on us to, as if we recognize our own power as human beings and our power to act collectively. I mean, he thinks that's really the key. And I think we're gonna, and I've just been spending time with my students. I teach a class called "What Is Freedom," and we, just spent, last week reading Taylor's wonderful book on Black Lives Matter, and I really sense a lot, in that book and what Taylor's describing. I think what she's advocating, she's thinking about what liberation really means, and part of what she's getting at, I think, is very much in the spirit of what I think Baldwin is getting at this kind of radically democratic vision. So yeah, I mean, it's and I have people, as I've been traveling around talking about the book, saying, what would Baldwin think of this 2020 field of candidates? And I mean, and I mean, and there are, I don't want to dismiss the question altogether, because I think there's some ways in which, because of a lot of grassroots things that have happened in this country over the last few years, there's a kind of political conversation happening among elites that in some ways Baldwin would, I think, be excited about, but he would always be there to remind us that the elite conversations are always going to be of secondary importance to the kinds of things that are happening on the ground. And so that's a kind of a thing that I think is really important that Baldwin reminds us to do, right, is that each and every one of us has this responsibility for trying to confront our history and take responsibility for it. And so that's kind of the central Baldwinian message, and exactly what that means for each of us is going to vary considerably, but that's something Baldwin calls on all of us to do.
Yeah. I just have one more question. Do you think that I think one of the lessons of Buckley is that the power of like ideology to shape people's minds. And his ideology was very cramped and very it was not particularly defensible in logical or empirical terms.
But you see, Ryan, white supremacy is okay if there's no hatred or racial animus.
Yeah,
I'm being nuanced.
Precisely. But do you suppose that Baldwin may have gone somewhat too far in the other direction? And I see it I certainly sympathize with his sort of instinctive knee-jerk skepticism of anybody in power, or any sort of movement. He said I'm maybe immune to indoctrination or something like that.
Right.
But you see the kind of utility and the the organizing force of a kind of way of seeing the world, that is, you could have nuanced versions of it or simplistic versions of it. It was just to say that something like Christianity or Marxism, Leninism, those had a social power which were far in excess of their kind of philosophical it's not like they were ironclad philosophically, I suppose. And do you think that he maybe missed that in terms of the way that people think about themselves, which seemed to be a subject he was pretty concerned about, and that people need ways to interpret the world rather than just I'm skeptical about anybody who seems to be selling any type of slogan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question, and I think I mean as you pointed out, I mean there's a way in which yes, we're bring Buckley back into the conversation for a second. I mean, as Baldwin looks at somebody like Buckley, right? Buckley is always, it's funny because he accuses Baldwin of being thoroughly ideologized and of being having this kind of radical philosophy in their encounters, but in fact, right? I mean, Buckley is the one who has taken ideological thinking to this extreme, and in a way, I mean, Baldwin is there to in a more powerful way than is just sort of beyond comprehension how powerful it is, because Baldwin is there to say, Buckley is saying to us, the core of my political philosophy is the inviolability of the individual. And Baldwin's like, really? Let's talk about that. let's talk about what like the Judeo-Christian tradition that you claim to be defending means to you. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all these things. And of course, in fact, right, Buckley's, understanding of those things is thoroughly ideologized to the point where, he built into his understanding of these ideas is this kind of exclusionary philosophy that reveals that he doesn't really believe in those things at all. But yeah, I mean, and so the question though is does Baldwin go too far in the other direction? And that I think is a really important question. I'm not sure I have a great answer to it. I mean, I think that one thing we see with Baldwin, and I kind of one way I was able to avoid having to engage this really hard question in the book is the kind of narrative wraps up more or less in 1968 with the epilogue kind of looking back at some of their legacies. And one of the things that's challenging with the kind of late Baldwin is he is kind of, in some ways attacked from the left, at least some folks on the left, and is for precisely this reason, right? I mean, one of the things that a lot of folks want to know, and this is, so he gets some people wondering, like, why is it that white people are willing to listen to you, James Baldwin? Should we trust you? And also this question of like, can we really fight back against, these various systems of power without ideologies that can help us make sense of the world and figure out what to do in order to change the world. And so I think Baldwin, there's some ways in which, I'll put a plug in for Eddie Glaude has a book coming out in April about late Baldwin. And so definitely you should have Eddie on your show.
Sure.
That'd be great. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I'll put in a plug for y'all for sure. But yeah, Eddie's going to grapple with like, sort of Baldwin, through, the kind of the later period in his life. And I think that one thing that's clear is that Baldwin, and he says, in a few places that he recognizes that there is a kind of utility to ideology, there is a utility to theology, and then he doesn't want to, call on people to reject those things altogether. I think what he wants to call on us to do, though, is that, if, for example, he gives the example of like, I think in a conversation or reflections on, the Black Panther Party, he's sort of supportive, like he'll go to fundraisers, he'll, sort of say things rhetorically supportive of the Panthers, but, but when it comes to the sort of ideological questions, he will, offer some general support, but he'll also be there to kind of raise issues and talk about, well, okay, how do we apply this idea to the world? How do we do it in a way that's humane and so on? And so I think Baldwin is kind of there to be, he always wants to say to us, like, as we reflect on our own ideological and theological commitments, he's just, he wants us to constantly be engaged in this kind of, Socratic kind of questioning of ourselves and of each other. And I think that part of, and the way we're doing that is not just to be annoying skeptics, right? But to be always cognizant of the fact that, whatever political doctrine we're talking about, whatever moral doctrine, whatever religious doctrine, he's always going to be there to ask us about, really the inviolability of the individual, right? The freedom and fulfillment of the individual. Baldwin says as early as, some of his earliest writings, 1948, he says, my primary concern is the freedom and fulfillment of the individual. And so any sort of theology, any sort of ideology that you present to me, I'm always going to be asking us to come back to that question. So I think and I don't know if that's fully satisfying, but I think that, in the moment we're having now with the political conversation, I think we're, in our own clumsy way, we're grappling with those questions of how do we take this commitment to justice and bring it down to the ground.
I love that. And I love that you just taught a course called What is Freedom? And later on off the pod, I'd love to talk to you about your syllabus and all that. But this question of what freedom is and the relationship between the individual and the collective, because I'm not going to, do one of those, would Baldwin have joined DSA questions or something? But like, I do think like democratic socialism wrestles with emancipation and liberation in terms of the relationship between the individual and the collective. And do you think Baldwin also, as much as he was focused on the individual, understood that individual freedom is bound up with seeing the interconnectedness amongst us and the collective, and the necessity for us collectively to think and act differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is one of the things that is really powerful, about Baldwin's, moral and political thinking is that he is somebody who is, I think, is very sensitive to, not only our individual. In some ways, he's like this radical. He's a very radical individualist in a particular sense in terms of his desire to see us kind of create ourselves and feel like we have the power, every day to sort of remake our identities. And I think he wants to liberate us to do that. But he also sees that, we are situated, right? And we are situated as social beings, and that we need one another, right? And this is a theme that he comes back to again and again in his, in his writings, is that, in order to engage, it's not like, we're sort of off, this introspective, this Socratic thing Baldwin's doing. He's not imagining us kind of off, reflecting on these things by ourselves. He's not, obviously that's part of, the human experience, but he really is somebody who, Baldwin, and when I think of Baldwin, like, everything I've read about Baldwin in terms of, the biographical writings, Baldwin's, ideal, I think, is he wants us to be engaged, maybe have a couple of drinks and to have these really honest conversations. I see you got your beer there. I should have brought mine upstairs.
We should have told you next time.
I know, next time, absolutely. But yeah, Baldwin, and I don't mean to be, frivolous about it. Baldwin really, these moments when we could have, really serious conversations about the things that matter, right? From the individual level of what our individual identities are and ways in which we need to rethink our identities each and every moment, but also ways in which, the relationship between our sort of individual identities and the collective. Baldwin, in terms of the kind of the message of something like the DSA, Baldwin is very much interested, right? And this is something he says in the Cambridge speech, is that, we shouldn't pretend that we as a society don't have the power to remake ourselves in radical ways. He gives the example of, New York. He says, if I take you to New York and we can see the ways in which that city is constantly remaking itself collectively, and then we see the way parts of that city are being neglected, right, or invisible to many people with power in that city. Baldwin is giving that example because he wants us to think about the ways in which we are making, through those millions of details of every day, we are making decisions that shape the kind of opportunities that individuals have for freedom and fulfillment. So our collective responsibility to one another is very much a powerful part of his message. And so all these things I've been saying about his skepticism of ideologies, I think needs to be, there's a big asterisk there, which is that Baldwin feels this very strong sense of collective responsibility that we have in order to create conditions under which human beings can flourish. And so exactly what that looks like politically, I think he would say to us, we've got to sort that out. We have an obligation, though, to sort that out.
Yeah.
Well, that's beautiful.
Yeah. And that's a good place to leave it, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for writing this book and for giving us an opportunity to do just that, to think about the ways we can be collectively responsible to fight the fascist white supremacists that are supporting the suppressive system, and to think about the beauty and wisdom of those in the past that have been brave and powerful in their fighting against it. So thank you so much for joining us and talking about that, Nick, and thank you for this book.
Thank you, Alexi. Thank you, Ryan. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the show and what you guys are doing. This is. I hope that the show lives forever. You guys are doing great work. So,
that's awesome.
Keep it up. And it's a very Baldwinian enterprise. So,
I love that. I don't know that we've got a better compliment than that. So that's beautiful. Oh, by the way, everyone, beautiful hardback book, also audiobook. If you're not into the exercise that comes with lifting a heavy book.
Yeah. It's called The Fire Is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and the Debate Over Race in America by Nicholas Buccola. And
How do you do? Ryan is infamous for
I love it.
Thanks, my friend. It's been a real pleasure. Hope you come back before too long.
I'd be happy to. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.